Welcome everyone to this webinar on the proposed federal plastics registry for producers of plastic products. My name is Jane Porter and I will be your moderator today. Next slide. We will have a mix of presentations and questions and answers throughout the next hour. You'll see on the Zoom webinar control panel below for some of the controls at your disposal. The main one that you will be using today is the Q&A button. So please use this to type in your questions and view the various questions being posed. All participants will be able to see these questions, and please use the thumbs up or like the upvote button if you would really like a question to be answered. As we won't have time to answer all questions, those upvotes will help us understand where to focus our attention today. And just to note, even if not all questions are answered, they will be reviewed and considered afterwards. Use the chat only if you have a technical question or if you have a question specific to our delivery team. And also to note, I know many of you are interested, these slides will be shared via email after this presentation. Next slide. A little bit about our team today. So as I mentioned, my name's Jane Porter. I'm with Stratos, an ERM group company. And then I'll pass it over to Shannon Castellarin, and then she'll provide some opening remarks and she'll pass it over to George Kendros. And with that, I will pass it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Jane. Just a quick signal check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'm happy to be here again. Really, it's almost been 2 years since we began discussions on a management approach for plastics. And so while we have taken action on certain single-use plastics, there certainly is more to do to reach our goal of zero plastic waste. And this is because, for the most part, we still have a linear plastics economy where millions of tons of plastics are disposed of each year. And in a circular economy, these millions of tons of plastics would have the potential to be a valuable resource. But achieving this circularity in our economy will require real systems change, with transformations in thinking and behavior at every point in the value chain. It will also require transparency in how we measure progress towards zero plastic waste, where having open and reliable data will be very important. And so this is where a federal plastics registry will have a role in providing a foundation for accurate and reliable information. A federal plastics registry will also allow us to measure progress on measures such as extended producer responsibility systems, as well as ensure that these systems are consistent across Canada. In July, we published a consultation document on a proposed federal plastics registry for producers of plastic products. This document is open for public comment until October 7th and is the subject of today's webinar, where my team will provide an overview and elaborate on some of the ideas presented in this document. So I do look forward to a productive session today. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, George Kendros, so we can begin.
All right, thank you, Shannon, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. So over here is a brief overview of today's presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about extended producer responsibility, some of the key elements of the Federal Plastics Registry, the proposed phased approach, the major milestone timelines, and then ultimately the next steps in our consultation process. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this webinar really is to walk through the consultation paper, which we published in July, to engage with our partners and stakeholders, with the Q&A, and really to gather feedback, which is key to us to help guide the development of the registry. Next slide, please. So just to give everyone a little bit of context as to where this initiative sits within the broader zero plastic waste agenda. So the government of Canada has advanced several international and domestic commitments to address plastic pollution and move towards zero plastic waste by 2030. So on the domestic side, we have been and continue to collaborate with provinces and territories in the implementation of the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste. So the strategy aims to reduce plastic waste and pollution and recover the value of plastics, and it outlines several priority areas of action. I won't go into too much detail on the action plan, as some of you may already be familiar with it. But if you are not, I encourage you to read both phases. And perhaps one of my colleagues can put a link to the action plan in the chat for anyone who may be interested to read it in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So as Shannon mentioned earlier, an important part of the action plan, towards achieving zero plastic waste is data. This data, as long as it is standardized and comparable, is crucial for evaluating the effectiveness of measures to advance a circular economy of plastics. So as outlined here in the table on the slide, the Government of Canada relies on a number of various sources for data on plastics and the circular economy. So on the federal level, the government has commissioned a number of thorough studies on plastics in the economy through our plastic science agenda. Other governments are also a source of plastic waste that we look for, from litter audits or surveys and studies on waste management and recycling systems that are taken by provincial, territorial, or municipal governments. We also rely on shoreline cleanup data, from across the country in different communities, in addition to data from the private sector through any industry-sponsored research or EPR reporting requirements. So while all these sources contain valuable data about plastics, they can sometimes be inconsistent in their definitions and their data points, and it can be difficult to compare plastics data. Next slide, please. So I'm going to jump a little bit to extended producer responsibility for a second, or more commonly known as EPR. So EPR is a policy approach in which a producer is made responsible for the collection and management of products and packaging at the end of their life. So EPR can take a wide variety of forms that some of you may be familiar with, such as take-back programs, curbside collection systems, or deposit refund systems. And when we're talking about full EPR, we're talking about that producers are fully responsible for funding and operating these programs, and for meeting targets for collection and management of materials. So the Government of Canada believes that EPR could provide this standardized, comparable data on plastics in the Canadian economy that is crucial towards moving towards zero plastic waste. My apologies. Next slide, please. And that is one of the reasons why the Government of Canada is interested in EPR, as it will play a key role as we move towards a circular economy for plastics. In Canada to date, the provinces and territories have shown tremendous leadership in developing and implementing EPR policies for a wide range of product categories, such as packaging and electronics in their own respective jurisdictions. So the government is committed to supporting these efforts by establishing a federal plastics registry and requiring producers to report annually on the quantity of plastic products in the Canadian economy. And the government really wants to work with provinces and territories to further advance EPR across Canada that is consistent. So rules need to be consistent across jurisdictions, really to create a level playing field, to reduce the administrative burden, and really to allow companies to take advantage of the efficiencies and economies of scale that are possible in larger markets that transcend sort of provincial and territorial borders. To work to advance EPR that is also comprehensive. So to help achieve zero plastic waste, EPR should extend to all major sectors of the Canadian plastics economy that generate large amounts of plastic waste. And to advance EPR that is transparent, where companies are made responsible for meeting outcomes such as collection targets, but are really given the freedom to decide how best to meet those targets, making accountability dependent on transparent reporting and then verification of that key data. Next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on this slide here, but it's really just to give everyone a visual representation of EPR programs in Canada right now. So as you can see, each province and territory is at a different stage with their EPR policies. And it really shows how there is not necessarily national consistency in EPR, and it's different as in different jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So one of the current gaps or limitations in EPR is that the extent to which EPR contributes to achieving zero plastic waste cannot really be fully evaluated. And that might be because, performance data generated from EPR programs can be difficult or in some cases impossible to accurately compare between jurisdictions and across different product categories. It could be because the lack of baseline data sort of complicates and lengthens the time needed for provinces and territories to develop these EPR policies for different categories of plastic products. EPR data is also typically only accessible, in annual reports that are published by producer responsibility organizations, or PROs as are more commonly known, and posted on provincial or territorial websites. Currently, no central source or one-stop shop for EPR data across Canada exists. And EPR data that is sort of verifiable and publicly reported both increases transparency and the usability of data for all stakeholders and Canadians. Next slide, please. So some key potential benefits of the Federal Plastics Registry include, first and foremost, open data. By applying government open data principles and accessibility standards, Canadians will have access to more data that they can use in research, business, or ultimately to hold the government and governments to account. Canadians will be able to access data related to plastic waste diversion more easily in a single repository. So another benefit is to provide comprehensive and comparable information. The Federal Plastics Registry would solicit and provide data on all major sectors of the plastics economy in Canada. This data would be comparable across jurisdictions and these product categories. This will help support effective performance measurement to help maximize the effectiveness of EPR in achieving zero plastic waste. Another benefit of the registry is that it would provide baselines for future EPR work. So provinces and territories would have a better understanding of sectors that place plastics on the market and provide input with respects to recycling rates. This will facilitate the expansion of EPR into new sectors, both contributing to the achievement of zero plastic waste and greenhouse gas emission reductions. Another benefit is the mechanism to support compliance with EPR. So provinces and territories will have access to new data to support enforcement and compliance promotion activities, which will help contribute to fair and more comprehensive EPR policies and help eliminate free rider problems, where compliant producers are forced to pay for the waste diversion costs of non-compliant producers. And lastly, a benefit is to inform and encourage investment along the plastics life cycle in Canada. So with consistent and verifiable data, businesses along the plastics value chain will be better placed to make investment decisions that will improve the design, manufacture, collection, and management of plastics. Next slide, please. So these are some of the key elements of the registry that we will go over today. So the first being product categories, what is being reported on. The second would be data points, what exactly should be reported, reporting rules, who is reporting, how can they report, and last but not least, open data and confidential business information, or more commonly known as CBI. So we'll start with the first key element of the Federal Plastics Registry, and that is the product categories that will be covered by the registry, and therefore producers will be required to report. So this chart over here on your left-hand side is taken from the consultation paper and is sourced from the Statistics Canada pilot physical flow account for plastic materials. And you should also note that these product categories align with the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment guidance document on EPR for plastics that was published earlier this month. I believe it was August 17th or the 18th. So the largest category of plastics, packaging, makes up 35% of all plastics in Canada. So packaging is defined as any material, substance, or object used for the containment, conservation, protection, handling, delivery, storage, or transport of goods, or that also acts to market, present, communicate information about goods. So packaging can range from everything from bottle and beverage containers to film packaging, other non-bottle rigid packaging, or foam packaging, for example. The next largest category is construction plastics, which make up 24% of plastics used in Canada. And they include plastic products that are typically used in the constructions of buildings or public works, such as pipes, flooring, windows and doors, or sidings. And just to note that there are currently no EPR policies in place in Canada to manage end-of-life construction plastics. So the next category is automotive plastics, which make up 16% of plastics used in Canada and encompass plastics used in vehicles such as cars, trucks, buses, trailers, snowmobiles. Electronic and electrical equipment is the next category, which makes up about 6% of all plastics in Canada and includes any product that requires an electric current to operate, regardless of whether it be a battery or a power cord that supplies that current. Next is textiles, which make up about 5% of all plastics used in Canada and includes products like clothing, interior textiles like bedding or linens, and footwear. Major appliances or white goods make up approximately 2% of plastics used in Canada and include such things as ovens, fridges, freezers, and air conditioners. And last is agricultural films, which make up about 1% of all plastics used in Canada and include products used in the containment, protection, handling, delivery, storage, and transport of agricultural goods. So next slide. And I think that I will pass it over to Jane actually, and we'll take a little break from the deck and for a first short Q&A session.
Great. Thank you, George. I'll get the spotlight here too. So we have several questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. There were also a few questions that people posed when they registered. And so we have some of those. So I'll ask the first question, and rest assured, we are going through all of your questions as they come in. But the first question is related to how the registry will interact with provincial and territorial EPR programs. This one will be for Shannon. So what outreach has ECCC undertaken with the provinces and territories, and how does the federal government intend to minimize administrative burden and duplication given the status of existing or planned EPR programs? And so I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Jane. So the federal government does have an ongoing relationship with the provinces and territories, and this is through the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, which is also known as the CCME. And through this relationship, we have become aware quite a bit actually of the work that the provinces and territories are doing in terms of implementing extended producer responsibility programs. And in fact, the leadership of the provinces and territories has really only accelerated since the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste was published in 2018. So given the unique circumstances of each province and territory in terms of developing and implementing their EPR, as well as the related reporting and data systems, we do intend to work with each jurisdiction and really explore the data sharing that they use. And we want to make sure that we're able to do this via one platform. So we want to use data from the existing plastics registry, our federal plastics registry, to minimize things like the risk of free riders and to really just support the overall effectiveness and even expansion of some of the EPR programs in the provinces and territories. Thanks, Jane.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Next question is for George. Who will be responsible for developing the public registry? Who will collect the data, and how will the data be shared?
Yep. So ECC, or Environment Climate Change Canada, will be responsible for developing the reporting instrument and the platform based on engagement with our partners and stakeholders. So producers, as defined by that future reporting instrument, will be obligated to respond and provide the data. However, ECC also envisions that producer responsibility organizations, or PRO, will play a large role in assisting producers in fulfilling their reporting obligations, as is currently the case in provincial and territorial EPR programs. And sort of to answer the last part of the question, Environment and Climate Change Canada will make reported data available to Canadians, subject, of course, to any need to protect confidential business information.
Okay, thanks, George. Next question for Shannon. Is the registry intended to capture both residential and industrial, commercial, and institutional materials?
Thanks, Jane. So the short answer is yes, it will capture both of these things, so long as they fall under the product categories that we are setting out. And this is certainly something we are consulting on at the moment through this process. So, and I just also wanted to emphasize that including the ICI, it is in line with the recently published EPR guidance document, which recommends that both sources of waste are covered. And the intent being here is that we have a better overall picture on the plastics and plastic waste that's generated and of course diverted in Canada.
Thanks, Shannon. So the next question, not sure if this is Shannon or George just yet, but what is the threshold for a producer to be considered? Oh, there we go, sorry. What is the threshold for a producer to be considered major and subject to the registry?
Hi, Jane, I can take that one. So this is actually an issue that we're consulting on right now. So we do know from the existing EPR policies that we've seen that small businesses are exempt. And we certainly are looking at the current thresholds that are used. For example, we do know that in some jurisdictions, businesses with less than 1 million in gross annual revenue are in fact exempt from obligations. And so this is where we're really considering, in fact, doing that, exempting small size businesses. But then again, the devil's always in the details. So again, this is where people have views. We do really want to hear from you. And some of the things we are thinking of are, do we exempt small businesses from having to register or even report? Do we have small businesses register, but then exempt them from having to report? Or do we require small businesses to register and report, but with reduced or no fees? So again, something that we are very interested in hearing people's views on through this consultation process. So if people do have ideas, I do consider you to bring them forward. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to make a quick comment here as well. So if you are typing in questions, I think there's a lot of activity happening in the chat, and we ask you for any questions that you're posing, use the Q&A button, and that will be shared with everyone. Whereas if you send your question directly to the chat, it is only going to us internally, and other people can't see that. So we ask you to please use the Q&A function. Great. The next one I think is for George. Oh, my computer went. 1 second. Is how is a producer being defined? Is a company that packages food products in plastic packaging considered a producer? Will the definitions align with EPR?
Yeah, of course, so I can take this one. So provincial and territorial EPR policies tend to define the obligated producer as the entity that, must manage the product at the end of the life cycle and therefore report on its performance. So each jurisdiction sometimes has its own definition or its own hierarchy, but typically jurisdictions attempt to target the brand owner. And as you will speak about it a little bit later in the PowerPoint, but there is a hierarchy that some PTs use, and that is in the consultation paper on sort of how to define who the obligated producer would be.
Thanks, George. I think we'll have a few other questions in a second. Appreciate all the ones coming in, though. There's a lot of interest, so thank you. Maybe actually with this, maybe George, if it's okay, maybe why don't you follow up with the presentation, because you might be answering actually some of the questions, and then we'll save more time as well at the end to respond to more.
Absolutely. Okay, so I guess if we can just go on to the next slide then. So the next key element for the federal plastic registry would be the type of data that is being collected. So data that collected could include sort of the following key data points as presented on the screen. And it's important to note that we would collect all of this data in weights, like tons, and not in units sold or units placed on the market. So we can go through each one of these data points. So plastics placed on the market is the amount of plastic and products for packaging that a producer places on the Canadian market in a given reporting year. Plastics collected for diversion is the amount of plastics that have been collected and recycled by an EPR program and sent to a sorting facility for diversion from landfill. Plastics successfully reused are the amount of plastics collected for reuse and sold onto secondary markets to be used again without any intensive repair, remanufacture, or refurbishment, whether that's for its original purpose or to fulfill a different function, versus plastics that are successfully repaired, remanufactured, and refurbished. So those are the plastics collected for diversion that is either sold onto a secondary market or returned to the OEM for repair, remanufacturing, or refurbishment via an intensive standardized industrial process that provides an opportunity to add value and utility to that product's service life. So plastics successfully recycled are the amount of plastics that were collected for diversion, reprocessed into raw materials, and sold onto the secondary market as inputs for new product manufacturing. Plastics incinerated for energy recovery, so the amount of plastics collected for diversion and recovered for energy recovery, so engineered fuel or mass burn, and then plastics imported exported, which is the amount of plastic waste imported or exported for recycling or final disposal. Next slide, please. So in addition to the data points shown in the previous slides, my apologies, the government could also collect some additional data points. And here's a list of these potential points, and they're sort of broken down into producers and more information on plastic products. So on producers, we would be looking at things like company names, addresses, GIS coordinates, contact information for authorized individuals, provinces in which a producer operates, and any identifying NAICS codes, and then for the producer to potentially identify whether or not they are subject to any provincial or territorial EPR obligations at this time, and whether or not they currently contract with a pro to fulfill any of those obligations. And in product types, we're looking at subcategory of certain products, the resin type of the plastic used, or the actual plastic type itself. So is it flexible or is it a rigid? So some of these data points, as you can tell, are to help the public better visualize the data spatially, like addresses and GIS coordinates, while others really give a more granular picture of plastics in the economy, by reporting on resin or plastic type. And we would very much like to hear from stakeholders on these data points and other data points that could be collected. Should additional or any other data points be considered that the government, has not considered or outlined in these past few slides? Please let us know. Next slide, please. So another key element, or the next key element, is who should report, similar to one of the questions that we got. So provincial and territorial EPR policies, tend to define the obligate producer generally as someone or the entity with the most control over the design of a product. So therefore, jurisdictions typically attempt to target the brand owner as the obligated producer. However, if this brand owner is not physically present in a jurisdiction, then other entities might designate the obligated producer following a hierarchy, such as the one shown on your screen right now. whereas the first importer or the distributor or a retailer may end up being the obligated producer. And it should also be important to note that the entity that may be best placed to report data may not be the one subject to a provincial or territorial EPR policy. For example, a brand owner may be headquartered in one province while its goods are sold in another province, where the first importer, distributor, or a retailer is obligated to report under that province's EPR policy. So while the Federal Plastics Registry is also looking to adapt a similar producer hierarchy, the obligated producer may also depend on the final instrument chosen and the authorities available for that instrument under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And that is to say that certain authorities within CEPA focus on certain activities, such as manufacture, import, and sale, rather than focus on an entity's place necessarily within a product's value chain. Next slide, please. So I believe Shannon touched upon this earlier, but as common with EPR policies, the Government of Canada is considering exempting small-sized businesses from all of the requirements of a producer registry. And in the consultation paper, we propose that a small business is someone with less than $1 million in annual revenue. However, that is also open to comment. So specifically, the government is considering sort of the following exemptions for small businesses. So exempting them from the requirement to register or report into the registry, exempting them from the requirement to report, but still requiring them to register and make themselves known, or requiring them to report and registered, but with reduced fees. The government is also considering requiring franchisors to submit a single report representing all information applicable for a franchise, and consequently exempting franchisees from having to report. So this would help simplify reporting, as franchise systems are often composed of many independent companies that would otherwise have to report separately. And this also tends to accord with broader principles of extended producer responsibility, as franchisees tend to have little or no control over the design or marketing of products. And this approach is also aligned with many provincial and territorial EPR programs, which allow or require franchisees to report together under the EPR system. Next slide, please. So the Government of Canada is considering allowing producers to submit data to the registry via authorized agents, such as producer responsibility organizations or PROs, as we understand that these reporting relationships already exist in the market. And we also understand that some data related to an EPR program, such as total amounts collected or recycled, may not be able to be attributed to one specific producer and may be able to be reported in aggregate. However, other data points, such as plastics placed on the market, would need to be attributable to a specific producer. So how would this producer report? So the government is developing a new reporting platform for the registry that we will be testing with stakeholders before actual reporting is due to begin. So this diagram here sort of shows the proposed process for reporting into that new platform, all the way from data collection, the actual reporting activity itself, and publication of the data. So a producer or a pro or both would collect, and calculate all of the required data points first. The producer and the pro would each have to also register on this new reporting platform. The producer would then have to identify their pro, or the pro, if they have one, could select the producer that they represent directly into the platform to establish that relationship. And then the pro or the producer, or both, would then submit data on an annual basis into the reporting platform. So the data would then be aggregated and randomized by ECCC officials to ensure that no confidential business information is linked or is attributable to any producer before it's published by Environment Climate Change Canada on the Government of Canada's open data website or directly on the reporting platform itself. Next slide, please. And the last key element of the registry is sort of open data and confidential business information. So open data is data that is structured, that is machine readable, that is freely transparent, and that most importantly can be used and built on without any restrictions. So open data would help Canadians make informed decisions, understand issues related to plastics and the circular economy, and hold the government to account. Therefore, the Federal Plastics Registry would aim to provide data received from producers open by default on a dedicated platform to the public, subject only to considerations relating to protecting CBI. So this data would be presented in a clear and easily readable and digestible format for Canadians. So they should be able to visualize the data in their provinces or across the country and be able to sort through it using various filters. And we would also provide raw data files on the Government of Canada's open data portal. And yet again, like I said, link them from the registry. Next slide, please. So while data should be open by default, the government understands that some information, should and needs to be protected as it could constitute CBI. So producers or pros who submit information to the Federal Registry would be able to make a request for confidentiality for each specific data point submitted. So requests for confidentiality would need to include a rationale for the request. And this rationale and this request would all be facilitated through this new reporting platform. And public access, therefore, to any data subject to a request for confidentiality would be limited only to aggregate data. And any information that could link individual producers to specific data would not be published. However, since provincial and territorial governments may need access to registry data for enforcement or performance measurement of EPR policies in the jurisdictions, the Government of Canada is considering providing all registry data to provincial and territorial governments. So this data would not be aggregated like it is at the public level, and individual data points would be able to be attributed to individual producers. So this would allow, for example, provincial or territorial authorities really to verify that producers on the federal registry are registered and paying fees under their respective EPR policies in their jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So this figure here just provides a sort of basic visual representation of data in the registry, how the data comes in and how the data goes out. So to highlight the key point here is that any and all data that is released to the public, either on the reporting platform or on open data, will be aggregate, and CBI will not be traceable back to producers. And the second stream is all data provided to the provinces and territories, would not be aggregate and may contain CBI that could be traced back to these individual producers. Next slide, please. So now that we've gone over all the key elements, we'll talk about the proposed phased reporting approach for the Federal Registry. So recognizing that provinces and territories are at different stages of implementing EPR, the Federal Registry is proposed to be implemented in stages or in phases. So this reduces the complexity and administrative burden of reporting, while also facilitating the expansion of EPR into new product categories in the future. So this phase approach allows producers time to build the capacity to report on data related to plastics diversion, while they're able to report on data on plastics placed on the market. So starting in phase one, we would begin with products that are already subject to EPR, like packaging and electronic and electrical equipment in most provinces and territories, since many producers may already have the capacity to report this data, and many producers may have this data as well. Next slide, please. So in the second phase, producers of the remaining product categories would begin reporting on plastics placed on the market, really to begin creating baseline for those sectors in the future. So the textile, automotive, and the construction sectors. So producers of product categories that came online in the first phase would need to begin reporting then on some or all of the data points that have been outlined in the consultation paper and in this deck. Next slide, please. So in the third phase, producers of product categories that began reporting on collection in the second would need to begin reporting on some of these diversion activities. And producers of product categories that are not subject to EPR policies in Canada at this time are still given some extra time to begin reporting on diversion in the next phase, which is phase 4. So if we can just please go to the next slide. So producers in the fourth phase then would need to begin reporting on plastics collected for diversion, reused, repaired, remanufactured, refurbished, recycled, or recovered for energy, for textiles, automotive, and construction. And then all sort of sectors are now reporting live. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the major milestones or the proposed timelines for the major milestones for the registry initiative. So the first milestone being in fall 2023 with the publication of the draft instrument that we published for a public comment period. So that public comment period and stakeholder and partner engagement would happen in winter 2023 before we publish a final instrument in the fall of 2024. So at that time, the government is also aiming to release a prototype of this new reporting platform to begin testing with stakeholders and working out any kinks before phase 1 reporting begins in 2025. And in 2025, when phase 1 reporting is slated to begin, the final version of the reporting platform will also be made available to all producers. So in 2026, phase 2 reporting would then begin. In 2027, all the product categories and data points for phase 3 would come online. And then in 2028, all the reporting for phase 4 would begin. Next slide, please. So we have a number of upcoming additional sort of technical engagement sessions as presented in this table here on the slide. And if you're interested in attending any of the sessions, we do ask that you contact us at the email here shown on the screen, or perhaps one of my colleagues can even post the online survey in the chat, and you can just click on the link and express your interest in attending any of the follow-up sessions. Next slide, please. And again, we strongly encourage all stakeholders and partners to submit comments on this consultation paper. You know, we want to read what you have to say, and we really will consider all comments that we receive in the development of the registry. And if you're unable to provide us with your comments at this time, then we strongly encourage you to provide comments during the public comment period that will follow the publication of the draft instrument in fall 2023. Next slide, please. And here are the 2 ways in which you can submit your comments to Environment Climate Change Canada, email and by mail if you prefer to do so. And then I will pass it on to Jane for the last Q&A session of the day.
Great. Thanks, George. And we see there are lots of questions coming in, so we appreciate all of that. So I'm going to pass it. Actually, I think pass it back to you, George. But how will data be protected, and how will the collected data be managed and made available?
Yeah, just give me 1 second here.
Not giving you a break, I know.
Yeah, so the government of Canada is considering, making data received from producers open by default on this platform subject only to considerations related to CBI. So this platform would allow the public to download or visualize any of the data in a range of formats, so XML, CVS, and sort of arrange them as they choose, by product category, jurisdiction, for example, and then we would allow raw data files to be available on the open data portal. But even the data provided on the open data portal would still protect CBI. And if there was any CBI in it, it would be stripped to ensure that, confidential business information of producers is always maintained and is secure.
Thanks, George. This one is for Shannon. How will you account for cross-border trade and multinational companies?
Thanks, Jane. So essentially, they will be treated like everyone else. So they will have to report on the data for any plastics that they put on the Canadian market. And so, in terms of what's going on internationally, we are aware of what's going on internationally. We do have the pulse on this, and we do continue to consult and remain engaged. But thank you.
Great. Next one, actually, I'll still pass to you, Shannon. Have you considered having all plastic manufacturers and importers report on plastics they put on the Canadian market and or export, and not just limit the data to producers covered by EPR programs?
So the short answer is yes, but we do realize that things have to happen in stages, and George pointed to many of these stages. So right now, our primary focus would be to target producers covered by EPR programs. But then that said, we are open to comments in terms of what the registry should cover and just how could we go to integrating other producers of plastic products in the future. And so ultimately determining who should report would also depend on, sort of internally the instrument that we choose to develop the registry. And so the reason I mention that is because under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, certain authorities give us different flexibilities. And so, really we're looking at, what makes sense in terms of who specifically we target with this registry. So we want to make sure that we're really, hitting the appropriate spot on the value chain for a giving, for a company's given mechanism and sort of how they tend to do their business, as opposed to, having a one size fits all. But again, this is sort of very early days for us, and we are really collecting information specific to topics such as these. Thanks, Jane.
Not sure who's going to take this one, but will the registry only seek recycling data from EPR programs, or will there be an ability to report on all recycling programs? So will there be EPR and Environment and Climate Change Canada registries created for the cardboard, glass, paper, wax, metals, adhesives, and organic industries? Is there Shannon or George? I'm not sure if.
Yeah, sure. I could take that one on. So the registry currently has 4 phases of implementation, starting with plastics that are already reported under PTPRs and then moving on to other sectors of the plastic economy. So after adding plastic manufactured items to Schedule 1 to SEPA, we may be currently limited by the scope of other materials. However, we do understand that provinces and territories are constantly adding and expanding to their EPR programs. And the registry could explore sort of expanding into these other materials like cardboard, glass, paper, wax, metals, like was said, in the future. And this is definitely something that we want to hear from stakeholders and, be provided some feedback from stakeholders on whether or not the registry should expand into potentially some of these other materials. So we look forward to sort of reading any comments on those.
Great, thanks. I think this one is for Shannon. What kind of Excuse
Oh.
me. It's okay. What kind of plastics are included in the plastics category? Are bioplastics or compostables in scope?
So essentially for a given category, all plastics would be in scope. So for example, if it was packaging that fell within, our definition would also capture compostable and biodegradable plastics. And so this is, of course, and George did allude to, these would be, we have the key categories that we're looking at. So it's the packaging, which would be also include beverage containers and single-use plastics, construction, automotive, electronics and electrical equipment, textiles, major appliances, and agricultural film. So again, if there are compostables within these categories, the thinking right now is that they would be captured.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Question for you, George. Will this be a voluntary registry? And if not, how will non-reporting producers be captured?
So mandatory reporting is being envisioned for the Federal Plastics Registry. So it will not be envisioned to be a voluntary initiative. And we're consulting to ensure that our scope is broad enough to capture as much data and to capture as many producers as possible. And depending on the instrument that is chosen that will enable the reporting, they are not voluntary, and there are consequences under SEPA for failing to either respond to, if it's a Section 46 survey, or failing to provide information that a regulation requires, a regulatee to provide.
Okay. Thanks, George. I think this one might be for you, Shannon. Producers are setting up a national registry for blue box materials, including plastic packaging. Is the government interested in working with producers to leverage that data so that producers do not have to complete the same reporting twice?
So yes, and as George did mention, we will be consulting with producers and the producer responsibility organizations, or the pros. And so we certainly are interested in how we can work together with our pros just to ease in the burden on producers and really ensure that we have a system that's effective, where we're really streamlined and there is only one spot for reporting.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. We've answered a lot. I know that there are a ton that have come in right now. So not sure if there's any, Shannon and George too, that you've been scanned. I know there's a lot of things happening, but if there's anything that has really, if you've seen anything, if you want to just quickly respond to anything, and some things might not have answers at this point in time. And so even if there's any comments of thank you for sharing that, and we will we'll be considering it, or some quick responses, feel free.
Yeah, I can step in over there. So for some of the questions that we received from stakeholders and partners during the registration, some of them spoke about sort of composition or restrictions of certain types of plastics. There was a question about PET, and then there were also some questions about certain additives, carbon black, I believe that I saw in there. So I think we just want to reiterate that the Federal Plastics Registry is solely interested in collecting data from producers and PROs, and it will not place any restrictions on the types of plastic, on any additives in plastics, and does not really mandate, producers to use certain plastics or certain materials in their products. The only thing that we are looking here is to get this information on plastic provided to the government. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that in terms of what the scope of the registry is. It is a data collection machine, so to speak.
So Jane, another question that I see received a few upvotes is in regards to our timing. So it mentions phase 4, it's going to begin in 2028, but yet, our goal is zero plastic waste by 2030. And so I think that's a valid point, but I think what's really important to realize is, we're sending the signal now. And the reason that we've allowed these phases to be phased in is because we realized in some of the later phases, EPR programs currently don't exist for these certain sectors. And so this is where, we want industry to start thinking about solutions. How can we design better? How can we record our data better so that we're able to reach that target? So it's really, again, we're walking together. Hopefully we should be walking in step, but again, it's to start making the changes, and the shifts that are needed so we can actually hit that goal. So again, good question. And I am hoping that during this consultation process for some of those items listed in phase 4, we can really work out, what are the data gaps and the details that are needed so that we can land effectively at this 2028 deadline.
Great. And then maybe this might be last one. We'll see you in terms of timing. But this appears to create additional administrative burden and cost to producers. Has there been consideration to leveraging the reporting already required for the provincial EPR systems, the current and the upcoming, and avoiding doubling the workload and costs inherent in this type of registry?
Certainly, that is our goal, to ensure that we can minimize duplication and level of effort. I can't really speak right now to cost, and that's something that we are only beginning to explore. But I think what we've certainly noticed is that when we scan across the different EPR programs, there are a lot of gaps in terms of what's collected. So, and it's not only the gaps, but it's to ensure that, we're comparing, comparable items. So we're finding right now that different programs, they report different levels of data, slightly different things. And so the data isn't really comparable. And so, yes, we're going to draw from these programs. We'll find commonalities where they exist. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be a delta for many of them. I don't think we're just modeling one and then everyone falls into suit. We'll take what we can from the existing programs, but I think the reality is we're going to need to go further and to ensure, that nationally we have the consistency that we need.
Great, thank you. One last one in the couple minutes that we have left. Where does chemical or advanced recycling fit in with the plastic registry? Is waste to energy or incineration, hang on one second. Waste to energy or incineration being considered recycling and therefore a preferred waste management solution in regards to making steps towards zero plastic waste?
So right now we're looking at, what are the fields that we need to collect? And George has outlined a few of them. I know some of the fields like, reuse are included. That said, we can look at the complete risk management, waste management hierarchy, when we do realize that is, that is sort of a rung on the hierarchy, sort of that energy recovery, waste to energy. So yeah, I think that's something we can look at. It's not, the first one that we're going out of the gate with. I mean, really, we're trying to get sort of on the higher aspects of the waste management hierarchy, more in the area of prevention, but it's certainly not off the table. And so, if this is something stakeholders want to talk about or have information on, this is the time to provide it to us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both, Shannon and George, for all of your work today in presenting and answering these questions. We see that there are many questions. They have been captured. We will be summarizing them as well. We will be sharing these slides afterwards. But we just want to say thank you all for attending this webinar and for participating. If you have any questions on the process, feel free to email Stratos at plastique-plastics@stratos-sts.com. We can put that in the chat here for you. If you have questions or comments on the content of the registry, you can send that to Environment Canada. They have the plastics email as well. The next web overview webinar on the labeling initiative will be on September 8th. And if you are interested in one of those technical sessions, you have until tomorrow to fill out that survey. We can put that link again in the chat. Many of you have already done that. And we'll be sending out, it's an invite only session. We'll be sending those out shortly. And with that, I will close this webinar. So thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.